Rosalind Voss had learned early that the kitchen was the one place in any house where a woman like her could disappear completely. Not because the work was invisible. The work was everything, the blood and bone of a household, the thing that kept powerful men fed and focused and human. But because the people who employed her rarely thought to look at the person doing it. They smelled the food. They ate the food. They felt the warmth of it move through them like a hand pressed flat against the chest. But they never looked up from their plates long enough to register the pair of hands that had made it. Rosalind had built a career on that particular invisibility, and for 9 years it had served her well enough. She was not a small woman. At 31, she carried 230 pounds on a 5'4" frame, all of it distributed with a generosity that the world had spent her entire life treating as an inconvenience. She had a full, soft stomach and wide hips that brushed the counters when she moved through a narrow kitchen, thick arms with the particular dense strength of someone who had been kneading dough and lifting cast iron since childhood, and a round, expressive face with dark brown eyes that missed nothing. She wore her black hair pulled back in a tight knot at the nape of her neck when she was working, which was most hours of most days, and she dressed in black chef's trousers and plain white shirts because they were practical and because they cost less than clothes designed to flatter a body like hers. She had long since stopped trying to flatter it. She had long since stopped trying to make it small. The position had come through an agency that dealt exclusively in private household staff for high-net-worth clients, which was a careful way of saying it placed people in the homes of individuals whose money had not all come from sources that appeared in public filings. The agency had called her on a Tuesday with a tone that was both urgent and deliberately vague. The household needed an immediate replacement for their previous chef. The previous chef had left under circumstances the agency described as a mutual parting of ways, which Rosalind understood to mean the man had either quit abruptly or been escorted off the property. The compensation was extraordinary, nearly 4 times her previous rate, with a private room in the staff quarters, full medical, and a monthly food budget that would have made most restaurant owners weep with envy. There was a 6-week minimum commitment and a non-disclosure agreement with enough zero-weighted penalty clauses to suggest that whoever lived in the Highland Park estate took their privacy with surgical seriousness. She had asked no questions she wasn't supposed to ask. She had signed the NDA, packed her knife roll and her mother's battered copy of Escoffier, and arrived on a gray Wednesday morning in March when the Chicago wind came off the lake like it had a personal grievance. The estate sat behind iron gates on a bluff overlooking a private stretch of shoreline. 3 stories of pale limestone and steel-framed glass that managed to be simultaneously beautiful and quietly menacing, the way very expensive things in very dangerous hands often are. A man named Caraway met her at the gate, checked her identification with the thoroughness of someone who had been trained to do it properly, and escorted her around to the service entrance at the rear of the house, without ceremony or conversation. The kitchen was the largest she had ever worked in privately, a 16-foot island of pale Calacatta marble, 6-burner Wolf range, 2 Sub-Zeros, a second prep kitchen accessible through a swinging door that Caraway told her was for the catering staff when the household entertained. She would not be cooking for events. She would be cooking for one. His name was never offered. Caraway referred to him only as the boss. The previous household staff, 2 housekeepers, Caraway himself, and a groundskeeping team who apparently lived in a separate structure near the back of the property, referred to him the same way, with a consistency that suggested it was a rule rather than a habit. Rosalind was given a printed document outlining the household's meal requirements. 3 meals per day prepared and plated, regardless of whether they were consumed. Dietary restrictions were attached on a second page. No allergies. No religious prohibitions. A strong preference for food that was, and this was the precise wording on the printed sheet, real. The word had been underlined in ink, which meant someone had added it by hand. She had read it 3 times, pressing her thumb against the indentation of the pen on the paper, and filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept the things that mattered. She did not see him the first day. She cooked breakfast at 6, a proper frittata with ramps and aged sheep's milk cheese, thick-cut prosciutto crisped in the oven. Bread she had started the night before using the sourdough culture she carried with her in a sealed container like a 6th vital organ, and left it plated in the warming drawer with a handwritten card noting the contents and timing. When Caraway retrieved it 40 minutes later, the plate was clean. She cooked lunch she did not see retrieved and dinner she did not see eaten, and by the end of the day, she had established the rhythm that would carry her through the weeks ahead. The kitchen was hers. The rest of the house was not. She did not wander. She did not explore. She cooked with the focused intensity of a person who understood that the work itself was the argument she was making, and she made it without needing an audience. It was the lamb that changed things. She had made it on her 5th day, a slow-braised shoulder that had been in the low oven since the previous evening, the whole house gathering the deep, earthy perfume of it by morning. Rosemary, garlic, the sharp sweetness of pomegranate molasses, a splash of a very good Barolo she had found in the wine cellar with Caraway's permission. She had served it with a hand-rolled pasta she had made at 4 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, and a salsa verde, so bright with herbs it looked like something pulled from a spring garden rather than a winter kitchen. It was the best thing she had made in years. Not technically. She had executed more difficult preparations in professional settings, but in the sense that she had made it with the quiet ferocity of a person who needed someone to understand something about her, even if that someone never looked up from their plate. She was cleaning the marble island when the door at the far end of the kitchen opened. Not the service door. The one that connected the kitchen to the main house. The one Caraway had told her was not used by staff. Rosalind set down her cloth and turned, and the man who walked through it stopped her breathing for a full 3 seconds, which she would later categorize as the most honest response she'd had to another human being in a very long time. He was taller than the doorframe had prepared her for, broad through the shoulders in a way that a very good suit could only partially contain, and he moved through the kitchen with the deliberate stillness of someone who had learned that moving slowly in a room made the room afraid of him, which was different from moving slowly because you were unhurried. He was perhaps 40, perhaps younger. His face was the kind that carried its age like a geological record, lines cut deep by things she had no language for yet, a jaw that looked like it had been decided upon rather than grown. His hair was dark and slightly too long, pushed back from his face without particular care. His eyes, when they found her across the width of the island, were a shade of gray that was nearly black in the kitchen's evening light, and they settled on her face with an attention so complete and so still that she felt the small hairs on the back of her forearms rise beneath her chef's whites. He said nothing for a moment. He crossed to the island, looked down at the plate she had plated for his dinner, the lamb, the pasta, the bright slick of the salsa verde, the wine glass she always placed to the right, and picked up the fork. He stood there, in the kitchen, and ate 3 bites in silence while she watched him, neither of them acknowledging the profound strangeness of it. Then he set the fork down with the same deliberateness with which he did everything, and looked at her again. She had the disorienting experience of someone looking at her and not finding anything to look away from. "You made this," he said. It was not a question. His voice was a low, carrying baritone that she felt in her sternum rather than just heard. "Yes," Rosalind said. He looked at the plate for another moment. Then he looked at her again. "What's your name?" "Rosalind," she said. "Rosalind Voss." He nodded once, the way people nod when they are filing something in a place they won't lose it. Then he picked up the plate, something Caraway had always taken to him, something she had never expected him to collect himself, and walked back through the door he had come from, taking the food with him into the closed interior of his house. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after the door clicked shut, her hands resting on the cold marble, and tried to identify the feeling moving through her chest. It felt uncomfortably like being seen. His name was Marco Salcedo, and she learned it the same way she learned everything in that house, in fragments, through inference, from the way Caraway said boss with a particular gravity that was not simply deference, but something older and more absolute, from the way the housekeeping staff moved more quietly on the days the main gate remained closed, from the name that appeared once on a legal document she was not meant to see when Caraway left it on the kitchen counter for 30 seconds. While he took a phone call, Marco Salcedo. She turned the name over in her mind the way she turned ingredients over in her hands, testing for weight, for texture, for what it might become under heat. She knew, in the general way that anyone paying attention in Chicago knew, what the Salcedo name meant. She had grown up on the South Side, close enough to the reality of how the city's underbelly operated to understand it without ever having been touched by it. The Salcedo family had controlled the import corridors along the Great Lakes for 3 generations, And the current generation had expanded that control into legitimate real estate and shipping infrastructure with a sophistication that made them nearly legally untouchable, which was not the same as safe. Marco Salcedo had inherited the organization at 33 after his father's coronary, a natural death. Every outlet had reported it, and perhaps it was, and had run it for 7 years with a reputation for being the kind of man who never needed to raise his voice because the people around him were too busy trying to prevent the things that happened when he was displeased to risk provoking them. She did not allow herself to be frightened. She was not, in any truthful accounting of herself, a woman who frightened easily. Her life had required a continuous low-grade courage that most people who had not lived her particular version of it mistook for toughness, when it was really just the practice skill of continuing to move forward in rooms where you had been taught that you were taking up too much space simply by existing in them. She had been a large woman in professional kitchens where the culture was brutal and the hierarchies were medieval, and she had cooked her way through every dismissal and diminishment until her food spoke loudly enough that even the people who preferred not to look at her had no choice but to taste what she made. She understood how to survive in the proximity of power. She understood, perhaps more fundamentally, how to make power need her. She had been doing it with a wooden spoon since she was 22 years old. What she had not learned, what no amount of professional competence had prepared her for, was what to do when power looked back. He came to the kitchen 3 more times in the second week. Always in the evening, always after Caraway had gone for the night, always through the interior door rather than the service entrance. As if the kitchen were the only room in the house, he felt the particular need to enter without announcing himself first. The second time, he asked her what she was making, and she told him, a Provençal fish stew, the kind her grandmother had made. Not the refined restaurant version, but the real one, rough and wine-dark and smelling of the sea. He asked her where she had learned it. She told him. He listened in the way people listen when they are not waiting for their turn to speak, and then he sat down on the tall stool at the end of the island and watched her finish it, and she cooked with someone watching her for the first time in years without feeling the urge to pull her chef's coat tighter across her chest. When she plated it, he ate at the island rather than taking it with him, and she cleaned while he ate, and neither of them said anything that was not necessary, and it was the most comfortable silence she could remember sitting inside. The third time, she had been elbow-deep in fresh pasta dough when he came through the door, and she had not heard him over the sound of her own kneading. And when she finally became aware of his presence in the room, her body registered it before her eyes found him. A shift in the air pressure, the faint cedar and smoke scent of him that she had started to recognize the way you recognize weather before it arrives. He was leaning in the doorway with his jacket off, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, forearms crossed over his chest, watching her work. She did not startle. She looked at him with flour on both arms and pasta dough under her fingernails and said, with a composure she was privately proud of, "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough," Marco Salcedo said, and the slight curve at the corner of his mouth was the first expression she had seen on his face that was not either blank or assessing. It happened quickly. It was gone almost before she had time to register it. But she registered it. "There's a stool," she said, and went back to her dough. He sat. He watched her work for 20 minutes without speaking, and she cooked the way she always cooked when no one was watching, with her whole body, rolling her weight into the dough, pressing the heel of her hand through it with a force that made the marble counter shift slightly. She was not a careful cook in the sense of being timid. She was a physical cook, and the physicality of it was part of what made the food what it was, the heat and pressure of her hands and the ingredients. The way she tasted constantly, 3 fingers swiped through a sauce and brought directly to her lips, without ceremony. The soft sounds of satisfaction or recalibration she made without meaning to. She forgot, for stretches of those 20 minutes, that he was there. That was how she knew she was comfortable, and that realization unnerved her more than his presence had. "You love it," he said, when she was rolling the pasta into sheets, his voice breaking the quiet without shattering it. "Yes," she said. She did not elaborate, because it was not a question that needed elaboration. "Why cooking?" he said. "You could have done something else with a mind like yours." She looked up at him then, the rolling pin stilling in her hands. The observation, delivered flatly, as a simple statement of what he had observed, landed in a part of her chest that she generally kept well defended. No one who employed her talked about her mind. They talked about her hands, sometimes, when the food moved them enough to want to attribute it to something concrete. They did not, as a rule, talk about the intelligence behind the hands. Because food is the most honest thing I know how to make, she said. It either is what it is, or it isn't. You can't pretend with it. Marco Salcedo looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. You can't. She learned the shape of his damage incrementally, the way you learn the geography of a place in winter. Everything covered, the real topography hidden, but present in the contours of what you can see. He had not eaten a meal cooked by someone who gave a particular care for what he experienced until she had started in his kitchen. This was something she understood not from anything he told her, but from the way his body responded to food that was made with intention. The almost imperceptible pause before the first bite of anything she made that was new. The stillness that came over him that was different from his ordinary stillness. Something that was almost recognition, as if he had expected indifference and received instead something that acknowledged him as a person who tasted things. His previous chef, she gathered, had been technically proficient and emotionally absent, and the household had eaten accordingly. Well-sourced ingredients treated with competence and no particular feeling. Rosalind cooked with feeling. She could not help it. She had tried in certain professional environments to produce the clean, elegant emotionlessness that fine dining kitchens sometimes required and found she could approximate it. But something always crept in through the edges, a personal preference in the seasoning, a choice of herb that was instinct rather than instruction, the particular way she built a braise that reflected decades of her own specific palate rather than a recipe. The food was always, unmistakably, hers. And Marco Salcedo, she was beginning to understand, had been eating institutional food in the privacy of his own home for years, and had not known until now that this was what he was missing. The fourth time he came to the kitchen, he brought company, or rather, company arrived before him in the form of two men who came through the service door at 9 in the evening with the specific kind of energy that Rosalind had learned to read quickly in professional settings. The controlled, held-tight aggression of people who were managing an emergency without allowing themselves to look as if they were managing an emergency. One of them was the scarred, heavy-set man she'd seen occasionally crossing the grounds, who she now understood was called Benedetti and occupied some position of authority in the household security structure. The other was younger, dark-suited, with the kind of face that had been recently reacquainted with something hard and was pretending not to be bothered by it. They had not expected her to be in the kitchen. Both of them stopped when they saw her, and Benedetti's hand moved inside his jacket with a reflexive precision that he controlled almost immediately, which told her several things about who he was and what the house was treating as a normal Tuesday evening. She was standing at the stove with a wooden spoon in one hand and a glass of the Brolo in the other, tasting a reduction she had been minding for 40 minutes, and she looked at both of them with a calm that surprised even her and said, "There's a pot of beef stock on the second burner if someone needs something to hold them together." Neither of them spoke. Marco Salcedo came through the interior door 17 seconds later, and the temperature in the room changed the way it always changed when he entered, that barometric shift she had started to catalog as reliably as weather. He took in the scene, the two men, Rosalind, the kitchen in its organized evening state, and whatever calculation was happening behind his eyes resolved into something that was not quite relaxed but was at least decided. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back at him. "I need the kitchen," he said. "I need 20 minutes, she said. There was a pause that the two other men seemed to find significant. Marco Salcedo said, "You have 15, and something that was almost definitely a smile moved across Benedetti's face before he controlled it, because apparently the concept of anyone in this house negotiating with Marco Salcedo for anything was remarkable enough to constitute an event. She had her reduction finished and her station clean in 14 minutes, and as she moved toward the service door, Marco Salcedo said her name. Not her last name the way he usually said it, but Rosalind, and she turned. He was standing at the island, his palms flat on the marble, and he looked at her with the specific expression she had been trying to read for 2 weeks and could not quite categorize, the one that existed between assessment and something more personal. "Stay in the staff quarters tonight," he said. "Don't use the grounds until I tell you it's clear." She did not ask why. She understood that asking why was not the protocol, and more than that, she understood, in the intuitive way that she understood when a sauce was about to break before it broke, that the situation had developed a gravity that she had not been hired into, but had found herself inside of anyway. "All right," she said, and she went. The morning came with a quiet that felt constructed rather than natural, the silence of a large house that had been thoroughly attended to in the dark, every surface cleaned of something she had not seen and chose not to ask about. Caraway appeared at 7 with a face that revealed nothing and the kind of careful courtesy toward her that suggested the household had decided on a particular policy regarding Rosalind Voss, and that the policy was protection. She cooked breakfast. She set it in the warming drawer. She made coffee from beans she had brought herself, ground coarse and pressed in a Chemex, because whoever had stocked this kitchen had not considered that someone might want coffee that tasted like coffee rather than like the idea of coffee. She poured 2 cups and left one on the counter with no card and no explanation, and sat on the stool at the end of the island with the other cup and her escoffier open to a page she had read so many times the binding was coming loose there. Marco Salcedo came through the interior door at 7:43. He saw the cup. He looked at her. She did not look up from her book. He picked up the cup, tasted it, and stood at the counter drinking it in silence for long enough that she had turned 2 pages before he said, "Who taught you to make coffee?" "My father," she said. "He was a very serious person about very small things." "Mine too," Marco Salcedo said, and something in his voice was different, not softer exactly, but less armored, a word said from a place slightly closer to the surface than his words usually came from. She looked up then. He was looking at the cup in his hand rather than at her, which was the first time she had seen him look at something that wasn't a person or a document, and the expression on his face was the one people make when they have been reminded of something they had decided was over. She went back to her book. He finished the coffee and put the cup in the sink with a care that was almost domestic, and she decided, in the way she made the decisions that mattered to her, that she was not leaving in 6 weeks. The threat arrived 10 days later in the form of a woman named Ilaria Conti who arrived at the estate in a car that was too expensive to need to announce itself, and did it anyway. Rosalind was in the main kitchen at 2 in the afternoon when Ilaria came through the interior door, the door that was not for staff, the second time in her employment that it had been used to deposit someone who did not consider themselves staff, wearing what appeared to be every square inch of fabric that could be responsibly attached to a human body without constituting a garment, which is to say very little of it. She was what the industry around women's bodies would have called exquisite, which meant narrow and angular and arranged, a collection of carefully maintained surfaces that had the quality of something that had never been touched and was not intended to be. She had dark hair cut to a sharp line at her jaw and eyes that took inventory of a room the way a person assesses property they are considering purchasing. She stopped when she saw Rosalind. The stop was controlled, a professional hesitation, not shock. Her gaze moved over Rosalind with a precision that was intended to communicate assessment and settled on an expression of politely managed contempt that Rosalind had been receiving her entire professional life and had developed a specific relationship with. It was the expression that said, "I see what you are, and it is less than what I am, and I am going to let you see that I see it, but I am going to frame it as observation rather than opinion because I have manners." Rosalind was dicing shallots with a 10-inch chef's knife, and she continued doing so without breaking her rhythm. "Marco didn't mention he had a new cook," Ilaria said, in the voice of someone who was accustomed to being the person rooms were rearranged for. "He probably had other things to mention," Rosalind said. "You're the one who's been here 3 weeks," it was stated with a quality that was not quite a question. "The one he keeps going to the kitchen to see." She let a beat land between them with the timing of someone who had practiced causing small injuries with good precision. "I hope you understand what that is and what it isn't." Rosalind set down the knife. She looked at Ilaria Conti directly, with the specific quality of attention that she brought to an ingredient she was evaluating, which was total and unhurried, and without the particular performance of emotion that the other woman was evidently expecting. "I'm the cook," Rosalind said. "I understand exactly what that is. Do you want something to eat, or did you come in here for a different reason?" Something moved across Ilaria's face that was too controlled to be called flinching. She opened her mouth, and Marco Salcedo came through the door. He read the room with a speed and accuracy that Rosalind was coming to recognize as one of his fundamental skills. 3 seconds, door to complete situational understanding. His eyes moved from Ilaria to Rosalind to the knife on the board to Rosalind's face. Whatever he found in Rosalind's face was apparently not distress, because something in his posture shifted from the specific readiness that she had noticed he carried when he anticipated a problem into something slightly different. He looked at Ilaria. "I thought you were leaving at noon," he said. His voice carried no inflection that indicated this was anything other than a logistical observation, which somehow made it worse. "I wanted to see you before I—" "Caraway will see you out," Marco said. He crossed to the island and picked up the cup of coffee Rosalind had been drinking from. He examined it. He looked at her. "Is there more?" "There's always more," Rosalind said. Ilaria Connie left without saying anything further, and the quality of the silence she left behind was the particular quality of a door closing on something that had been decided before either of the people in the room had announced a decision. Marco poured a cup from the Chemex and stood at the island and drank it, and Rosalind went back to her shallots, and neither of them made any reference to what had just occurred, because what had just occurred needed no reference. It was already understood, in the way that the best communications between people who are paying genuine attention to each other are understood, without the intermediary of words. 3 days after Ilaria Connie's departure, a man named Severin Dratch arrived. He came not through either door, but through a report that Benedetti delivered to Marco in Rosalind's presence because she was in the kitchen, and Benedetti had apparently, over the preceding 2 weeks, made the assessment that she was trustworthy enough to be present when things were being said that were not meant for the uninitiated. Dratch was, according to Benedetti's clipped and specific language, a contractor who worked for the Messina organization out of Detroit, who had taken an interest in the Salcedo family's lake shipping routes following the disruption of the previous month, which Rosalind understood from context to be the event that had kept her in the staff quarters one particular night. He was in Chicago. He had been asking questions that people did not ask unless they were being paid to ask them. The asking of those questions had a historical pattern that Benedetti traced with the expressionlessness of someone delivering a weather report, and the historical pattern ended, in the cases he could document, in things that were worse than asking questions. Marco stood at the counter with his coffee and absorbed this with the stillness that she had spent 3 weeks learning to read. When Benedetti finished, Marco said nothing for a moment, and then he looked at Rosalind, not because she was supposed to be addressed in this conversation, but because she understood now. He was in the habit of looking at her when he was thinking about something that mattered, the way some people touch a particular object on their desk when they need to concentrate. "You cooked tonight?" he said. "Osso buco," she said. "It's been in the oven since morning." "Good," he said, and he and Benedetti left the kitchen together, and Rosalind stood in the good smell of the braise and let the information settle into the part of her mind that organized and filed and cross-referenced, because she was, and this was the thing about her that most people who dismissed her failed to account for, a person who thought about everything she heard with the same precise attention she brought to a recipe, which meant that by the time the osso buco was finished, she had understood several things about Severin Dratch and what he was likely looking for that she was fairly certain Marco Salcedo's security apparatus had not yet connected. She served dinner at 8. Marco came to the kitchen and sat at the island rather than taking the plate to another room, which he had been doing for a week now, and she stood on the other side of the island with her wine and her own plate. He had told her once, in the way he told her things that were actually directives framed as observations, that she should eat at the same time he did, because food eaten alone was not eating, it was maintenance. And they ate in the comfortable silence that had become the structure of their evenings. When he was nearly finished, she said, "The shipping manifest discrepancies from February and March." He looked up. The stillness that came over him was absolute. "What do you know about shipping manifests?" "I know that the agency that placed me runs their payroll through the same Delaware LLC structure that 3 of your legitimate subsidiaries use," Rosalind said calmly, setting down her fork. "I know because I looked it up in the first week, because I take security seriously in my own right, and I wanted to understand the structure of what I'd signed on to. I also know that the February and March manifests had a recurring 12-minute delay at the Calumet terminal on specific alternating Thursdays, which I could see from the loading schedules that Caraway keeps on the kitchen bulletin board and which I memorized because I memorize things. That 12-minute window corresponds to a shift change. If someone wanted to move an addition to an outbound shipment without triggering the standard documentation, 12 minutes in a shift change is exactly the gap they'd use. And if Dratch's organization is asking questions about the shipping routes, What they're probably looking for is who left that gap open and whether they can use the same person again. Marco Salcedo set his fork down with the precision of a man, ensuring that his hands were completely controlled before he spoke. He looked at her across the marble island in the evening light of the kitchen, and the expression on his face was not any of the expressions she had catalogued over 3 weeks. It was not assessing or guarded, or that particular almost smile, or the barometric warning she had learned to read before a storm. It was something she did not have a name for yet, something that was still in the process of becoming itself, and it held in it a quality that made the warmth move through her chest differently than it had before. "How long?" he said, and his voice was very quiet. "Have you been thinking about this?" "Since Benedetti mentioned the month," she said. "So about 3 hours." Silence. A long one, the kind that he used when something required actual wait rather than response. Then, "Come with me." She followed him through the interior door for the first time, into the part of the house that had been, for 3 weeks, the geography beyond her jurisdiction. He took her to a room that was clearly a working study rather than the decorative version. Bookshelves with actual books in them, a desk that bore the marks of consistent use, a board on one wall with a map of the Great Lakes shipping network and a series of dates and notation marks that she absorbed quickly as she crossed to stand beside him at the desk. He pulled a ledger from the second drawer, opened it to February, and placed it in front of her. She read it. She was silent for 4 minutes. Then she pointed to the third entry on a Tuesday in the middle of the month and said, "There." They worked for 2 hours. She did not have training in this, had never studied logistics or criminal operations or anything that the people in Marco Salcedo's world were trained for, but she had an accountant's instinct for patterns and numbers and a cook's instinct for the thing that was slightly wrong in a preparation. The moment when something that should harmonize is instead working against the whole. The discordant note that an experienced palate catches before the dish fails. She caught 6 discordant notes in the February and March records that Benedetti's team had not flagged because they were looking for dramatic anomalies rather than small, patient ones. By the time she stopped, Marco was leaning on the desk beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat from his arm against hers, and he was looking at what she had found with an expression that was the most unguarded thing she had seen on his face. "You could have told me this over dinner," he said. "I didn't know all of it over dinner," she said. The ledger filled in the rest. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at what was on the desk. Then he looked at her again, and she understood from the quality of that second look that something in the composition of the room had shifted in a way that was not going to unshift. "Rosalind," he said, just her name, with a weight to it that was different from the weight he had given it previously. She was looking at the ledger, and she made herself continue looking at the ledger, because if she looked at him in that moment, she was not sure she was going to be able to maintain the composure that had, up until now, been the thing keeping her from acknowledging what was happening between them. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Then ask it," she said. "Why are you still here?" he said. "The 6-week commitment was a minimum. You have options that don't involve this. You're smart enough to have found them by now." She looked up from the ledger. She looked at him directly, with the full attention she gave to the things she was honest about. "The food here is worth making," she said. "The person eating it is worth cooking for." She paused. "That's the first time in 9 years I've been able to say both of those things at once." The silence that followed was the particular quality of a thing that has been said and cannot be unsaid and does not need to be expanded upon because it contains its own completeness. Marco Salcedo looked at her for a long moment, and the expression on his face was finally one she recognized. It was the expression of a person who has understood, suddenly and without the possibility of return, that something has become necessary that they had not anticipated needing. He reached across the distance between them. Not far, they were standing close enough that it was barely a reach, and his hand came to rest on the side of her face with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with every surface he presented to the world, his palm warm and slightly rough against her cheek, his thumb at the line of her jaw. She did not move. She felt the warmth of it move through her the way good food moves through a person, slowly, from the center outward, reaching all the cold places. "Stay," he said. Not a command. A different kind of word entirely. "I'm staying," she said. He found Severin Dratch's inside contact 2 days later, using the information Rosalind had pulled from the ledgers, and the situation was resolved in the way that situations were resolved in Marco Salcedo's world, swiftly, permanently, and without further discussion. Benedetti came to the kitchen the morning after and stood in the doorway with the particular expression of a man who has revised a prior assessment and is not entirely comfortable with how significantly he has had to revise it, and he said, "The thing you found in the February records. You should know the Messina organization's people were in Chicago for 10 days, and we had no idea how they were getting their information," he paused. "The boss wants you to have whatever you need for the kitchen. Budget is open," he paused again. "Whatever you need." Rosalind looked at him. She recognized the communication for what it was, not quite gratitude, from a man who did not express gratitude in recognizable forms, but something in the same family. An acknowledgement. She had been acknowledged before in professional settings, and it had never felt like this. "Tell him I need a good pasta roller," she said. "The hand crank one is adequate, but I want the motorized version." Benedetti nodded without the expression of a man who found this request incongruous, which meant that he had already fully recalibrated, and left. She went back to her bread. The evening that followed was the first in which the quality of the kitchen changed entirely, not in its physical dimensions, which remained the same, but in the particular way that rooms change when the people in them have stopped pretending to be something they're not in each other's presence. Marco came through the interior door at 7, jacket off, sleeves already rolled, and sat at the island without ceremony. And she cooked for him the way she had been cooking for him all along, but without the small layer of professional performance she had been maintaining, cooking as herself, fully, the way she cooked alone at 2 in the morning when no one was watching. She made him a dish she had been saving, not saving deliberately, but the kind of saving that happens when you know something is for a specific moment and wait for the moment to announce itself. Her mother's roast chicken, the one her family had eaten on the Sunday nights of her entire childhood, the one that was not technically impressive and did not require any particular skill beyond the decades of accumulated understanding of exactly how long, exactly what heat, exactly how much salt, and the particular way of resting it, that meant the first cut released a specific quality of steam and the skin held its sound all the way to the plate. She set it in front of him without preamble and watched him eat the first bite and watched his face, which was the face of a person who has been given back something they had not known was missing. He did not say anything for a long time, eating with the absorbed focus of someone who is tasting something they cannot fully account for, the way you cannot fully account for music that moves you or a sentence that reaches somewhere precise inside you. When he finally looked up, his gray-dark eyes were different in a way she had no word for yet, something rawer than his ordinary expression, something that had been reached rather than chosen. "What is this?" he said. "Sunday dinner," she said. "The real kind." He looked at her across the marble island with the chicken between them still steaming and the kitchen smelling of it, filling the large room with the particular warmth of food made without pretension and without anything held back. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for 3 weeks, but without the layer of containment that he had been maintaining over it. And she looked back at him with the full honesty that was the only mode she knew how to operate in when something actually mattered, and the kitchen held them both in its warmth, and the roast chicken cooled slowly between them, and Rosalind Voss understood, with the bone-deep certainty of a person who has been paying precise attention to the truth of things since the beginning, that she had not come to this house to be invisible. She had come to it, by whatever crooked road of accident and intention had brought her here, to be exactly and finally seen. Rosalind Voss arrived at Marco Salcedo's door carrying nothing but a knife roll and the knowledge of how to make the world stop for a moment in a bite of something real, and she left that first day changed in a way she could not yet name. Because the most dangerous thing in a ruthless man's carefully armored world turned out not to be the rivals at the gate or the traitors in the ledgers, but a woman who cooked with her whole heart and had never once been told it was enough. She was told now. She was more than enough. And anyone who thought otherwise would find that Marco Salcedo's patience, which was considerable, did not extend to people who failed to understand the value of what sat at his table.